my name is Kendall Gelner. I'm here to talk about Play First development, and this is kind of a little continuation in the series of playground talks we've been having. Only this time, I mean to talk a little bit more about playgrounds, kind of in a sense from using from Xcode and on the Mac, and a little bit more sort of presentation sense rather than purely educational or interactive and learning. Something I've mentioned is that I'll go through a few sample projects as I go through this. Those can all be found at the bottom URL there, the tinyurl.com, playfirstdev360idevbin 2016. And I also am on Twitter, and you can feel free to email me too with any questions you have about anything. I'd be happy to answer. So just a little bit about myself also, just because you have to say something. I just wanted to mention I've been programming for a while as well, and I just wanted to mention Stack Overflow briefly because I also hang out a lot on Stack Overflow, not as much these days as I used to, but I'm happy to answer questions there too. And if you put playground questions up there, especially, I'll probably be trying to monitor more playground stuff going forward and Swift things also. So the kind of origin of this talk is that I've thought for a long time about sort of the relation of testing to developing and what is a good mix of the two. And the thing that excites me about playgrounds is they're a little bit like testing in a way in terms of the way that people think about test first development. And so they kind of come from a similar place, or they can. Like test first development kind of came around because people want to be able to see stuff running before it's fully fleshed out. They have a sort of superstructure in mind. They want to see how well it works, and testing can help build methods to understand if that's going to work okay. Testing is a good way, of course, to verify everything is working as you're building it. But the problem is that test first development, I think, went maybe a bit too far. Like in practice, not everyone really builds tests for just everything. And some of that is because just tests can be overbearing and burdensome, really, the whole process. So what kind of things can go on? Well, I mean, the problem is testing frameworks themselves require understanding to use. And so you get kind of lost in trying to set those up, and it's a big burden and overhead just trying to figure out even maybe what testing stuff to use. Even for stuff that's built in, it can just be work to set it up and keep it going. And then another problem is I don't think that people understand that. I think of tests personally as maybe there's a couple different kinds of ways to think about testing, in that you can have tests that are like scaffolding. They help you build up something, but then maybe they should just go away. Like you wouldn't build a building, put up a bunch of scaffolding, and then maintain the scaffolding along with the building. But I think that's what a lot of people do with tests, actually, is they're maintaining scaffolding along with more structural things that really should remain. And then, of course, the problem is like I said, you maybe build a building with scaffolding and you leave it up. You maintain that, too. You're replacing the wood or the superstructure or whatever, and tests are the same way. Sometimes tests can just be there forever. You're maintaining the test along with the code, when really the test should have been gotten rid of long ago, because they aren't helping you at all. They aren't ever finding anything. They aren't really providing value. So, and they can slow you down too. Like if you want to change something in code, which is a lot more necessary in code than it is in something like a building, you're kind of want to restructure how the code works or make any changes. The problem is tests can really make that hard to do, and maybe even make you decide, well, I'm not going to change that because then I would have to fix all these tests up or repair them, and so I'm just not going to fix that. But that shouldn't be at all. You should feel free to make changes as much as you want at any time to just explore to see if something works better a different way. So the solution that I'm proposing is to kind of think about it maybe as using a lot more of a play approach to this. And so the thing is that playing is actually really a good idea to incorporate into anything. Like there's a lot of studies now showing that really creativity in business is super helpful and a good thing to try and integrate into your business processes. And it just makes everyone a little bit better at what they're doing if they can be creative and think about stuff and really play as they go. And the nice thing about play too, I talk about in some other talks I've done before, I talk about intuition. I think play really helps raise the aspect of intuition in your thinking because you have a little more freedom in thinking. Like if you're trying to approach things more rigidly, you really kind of lock into an approach and you just kind of head down that direction. Whereas if you're playing, it's a lot more of an explorative process, and you can kind of think of things you might not have thought of before because your mindset would have been kind of locked in. So again, play is kind of is exploring, like it's widening what is possible to think about, and just then what you can do. And it means taking unexpected turns especially. And this is again where just the freedom to play gives you the ability to try out ideas quickly and discard them, and maybe take an approach you never would have thought of before if you weren't trying a lot of quick iterations of just messing around with stuff. So then we come to the question, well, let's say we want to use playgrounds to do all this. That sounds great. So why isn't everyone kind of doing something like this? Because it sounds a lot of fun and really interesting. Okay, well, so until recently, playgrounds weren't that great. I mean, it's taken a while to get playgrounds to where they are. Even though I'm talking about playgrounds in Xcode, of course, iPad playgrounds are super new, and they're kind of nice, but playgrounds have been around in Xcode for a while, but it's really taken a while for them to get to be useful, I think, because for the longest time they were buggy. I mean, they're still a little buggy, I would say, but they're not nearly as bad as they used to be. And they have all these limitations, too, that when you try and use them, you're like, well, this is nice, but it's really limited in what I can actually explore. And so some of that is because you have code in your own project, you want to try using it, well, you can't really see that from the playground. So I'm just going to copy some stuff in, and after a while you get to copying a few things in, and that's just too much of a mess, so you stop bothering with it. Another thing is, you're doing a lot of your work in storyboards, you'd like to explore that. Well, playgrounds can't see a storyboard, so you can't use that. And also like third-party libraries and helpers. I think someone else asked me about this at lunch the other day. You want to use something like AF networking or some other cool library. Well, you can't see that from a playground, so I just can't do that either. So, and then also, of course, a lot of us have Objective-C code still that we're doing stuff with, and you can't put Objective-C in a playground, so that's another limitation. So what I'm going to go into is kind of how you get around all these limitations and actually be able to use playgrounds with all these things to make them more useful for you. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we look kind of more closely at what playgrounds can actually see. So what they can see is stuff that's in the current page, and then Craig actually talked a little bit about this the other day, is that they have the playgrounds have pages and chapters and all this other stuff, and playgrounds can see stuff in this particular page. They also have this hidden sources directory that you can add stuff to that's not visible in Playground, but they can see that, so that's sort of helpful. They can also see frameworks in the workspace that you're in. This is a little bit more technical, and we'll get into more of that in a minute, what that really means. And there's a little caveat there, is that the frameworks that the Playground can see have to be included in a target that is built by that workspace. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And it has to be compiled for the simulator, because the Playground is kind of really running a simulator behind the scenes, so the Playground has to also have been compiled for the simulator for the Playground to see it. So that sources directory I mentioned, that seems like an interesting idea. Maybe we can put some stuff there. And I actually did some exploration of this, like how you could maybe make use of this to expand what a Playground can work with. Okay, but the problem is it's not that great. It's really still in the same sandbox. I tried to actually do a little bit of trickery and make it see some stuff that would have maybe not seen otherwise by using symbolic links and also aliases. Neither of those really work at all. I wouldn't recommend them, especially symbolic links really mess with it. That's just more of a lower level thing, and it really got confused when I tried that. So don't do those things. But that leaves us with frameworks, which is the only remaining choice, and luckily one that actually works pretty well. So what can we do with frameworks? Like, what could this really mean? I mean, people don't use frameworks a lot, so how can this be useful to us? Well, the nice thing is that we can move a lot of our own code into smaller embedded frameworks within our project, kind of break out your application into littler frameworks, or maybe a framework that mostly deals with one core part of your app, and then all of a sudden you're able to access this from a Playground. You can put other things into frameworks. Frameworks are great because you can put other resources in them. That includes storyboards and images. And if you have those in there, then the Playground can see those too, which is pretty cool. A little note about that is that if you put storyboard references in frameworks, you have to include the bundle identifier in the interface builder. So if you're building a storyboard reference, if you're building a storyboard and you're breaking apart storyboards now, there's this thing called a storyboard reference where you can say, I want to, say, have a push segue off to some view. It's in a whole different storyboard, which is something you probably want to do if you're breaking out into frameworks. And if you do that, you not only have to include the storyboard name that you're segueing off to, but if you have it in a framework, you have to include the bundle identifier too, where that storyboard is held. And then after that, it just works. Like, you can segue from a framework or from a storyboard in one project off into a storyboard that's held off in a workspace. So that's kind of cool. Frameworks can also be built with Objective-C too, and they're visible in Swift and everything. So that's great, is that you can take some of your Objective-C code and kind of put it away in a framework and make that more visible and even usable by by playgrounds too. So you can start making use and do calls of the things that you had in Objective-C. Let's see here. Oh yeah, and then anything that you want to get out of a bundle, a lot of us have probably used the methods that call like load nib or load whatever from a nib, and with a bundle. And so these are pretty common things where you're saying something like create a storyboard, or you're loading an image and you're trying to load a view controller maybe with a nib and a bundle. Well, the thing is, if you use a name, now the bundle comes into play if you're using frameworks, where you actually make a bundle that represents the framework that you're loading something from. And this is the way that you can load stuff from just as you're used to, only now instead of nil for bundle, you actually pass something real, which is the framework that you've put something into. So that's kind of a lot to think about and go over, so I wanted to actually show you what that looks like in practice. And so I'm going to go into Xcode, and I'm going to just show you real quick what that looks like to actually move some code into a framework, and just how simple it can be. So here I have my class. It's just a simple class. It's all public. So in theory, I should be able to see it from anywhere. And like I said before, playgrounds are great, but they can't see stuff in your own project. So here I have a playground, and it has a reference to my class, but it says it's bad. It can't find it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this class and we're going to put it into its own little framework. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to say, up here, File, New Project. And of note is that I've highlighted my kind of project level directory up here. And the reason is because I want to create a new framework. So I'm going to say New Project, Cocoa Touch Framework. But you need to put this project, is very important, you need to put it underneath the project, sort of the master project for your application, or it won't be able to really link in a way that will be good for you. And I'll explain what that means, more about that in a second. So I'm going to call it Classy. All right. And we'll just put it, oops, I lost track of this. There we go. So I'm going to create a directory for that. And instead of don't add it to any project or workspace, which you normally do, I'm going to add it to the simple play app, which is the workspace. So I've wrapped everything in a workspace here. In order to use frameworks with your project and playgrounds, going back to what I said before, you really need to put everything into a workspace. So I have this whole app in a workspace now, and when I create this project, it's going to say I want to add it into the workspace and also into this group with the same name. So I'm going to do that. What did that say? Okay, so now I have this other Xcode project here, which lives under my main project, and this is a framework, as we can see from products. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this thing and I'm going to copy it in here, and just for fun, I'll just say copy it, so I have the original file left in there. And I'm going to take this out of this target, and now I have my class that's moved into a sub-framework, and it's compiled for that. There's one more step that Xcode didn't do for you, and I don't understand why, but it didn't, so I got to tell you what to do to actually make this function. And that is that all of these, when you add a framework into here, you need to make sure that it embeds the binary of the framework along with your project. So it's really easy to do though. All you have to do is go into the products thing. So I just have the classy framework thing there. And I'm just going to drag that over into embedded binaries. Okay, and now you can see it says that it's including the framework there, and it's going to link it there too. Now, the reason why you want to make sure that the framework lives underneath the project, and by that I mean, again, the project level is up here. This is my simple play app, and then the actual project file for the workspace lives under there. You want to make sure that's happening because Otherwise, if you put it outside of there, this is a hard-coded path and not a relative path. Like right now, this just says build / debug whatever. But if you didn't do it that way, it would actually have a hard-coded path to your username directory, which is really, then you can't use it with anyone else. You can't really share the project, and if you change machines, it might not even build. So it's really bad, but this way it will work. And so now, if I just go off to, back to this playground, I have that class file in a framework now, so it's got to be in there. And so now the whole thing is good. It actually can load my class, and you can see it compiled it for the framework kind of automatically, and then it just loads it and it works. So it's just really that simple to create a framework and then just start putting things into it. And you can shift as much or as little as you want to do a framework. I would caution you that you should not make too many frameworks, so maybe it's good to combine a number of things in there. But really, you can make any number of frameworks and include them this way, and it will be fine. So, going back to this, there's a few other notes about this. I already talked about the path thing, and frameworks need to have a module name. If I had Objective-C code that I did the same thing to and put it in a framework, you have to change the module name in the build settings so that there is one, because an Objective-C stuff just doesn't have a module name by default. Also, let's see here, if you have an Objective-C framework, this is kind of more for reference later. These slides, I'll put up that link again at the end so you can download them. But if you have an Objective-C framework, you need to make sure that the framework headers are public. So if you're copying Objective-C code into a framework, just make sure as part of the build phase that those get exported so that everything can see the Objective-C header files. And actually a side benefit of this, too, is that if you start putting stuff into little frameworks, often as we're building Swift code, we kind of ignore the public-private settings for things because you kind of can leave everything as internal and it works across the whole project further and further. But if you're building frameworks with the Swift files, the great thing is that kind of reinforces the notion that what you make public versus what you keep within the framework. And you just naturally start setting that because you have to in a framework. So it's actually kind of a good practice anyway, and it helps you out with building a little bit cleaner code. So I wanted to show you other things that you can do with this thing. So what this means when we can use frameworks for stuff. So the first example is core data. And I have another example project here. So what we have here is I have a little framework set up that has some core data setup code in it and some core data classes and things. So I've effectively moved my data model into a framework for this example little application. And so what happens here is I do a bunch of setup stuff, but the most interesting, actually interesting stuff of this playground is more at the end here. So first of all, I have a bit of setup code that will actually create a core data object, and then it saves it, and then it gets it out and searches for it here. You can see at the start there is no object. It tries to search, but there's no results over here. So let's let it actually create this thing. So I'll uncomment that. And you can see after you type stuff, I mean, it pretty much tries to run it right away. So that's kind of a cool thing about playgrounds is that as you're typing, as soon as it can, it tries to give you out results. And it says that now I've created an object and the name is Fred. Well, let's say I want to change the name of that thing. I'm going to uncomment this to show you it'll run again, and it's still found the same object. So core data has created a persistent object now that exists between runs of this playground. I'm going to change the name to Jim, and you won't see that take effect right away because it printed out the name before I changed it. So I'll just change it back. And you can see now that that actually also persisted. So I changed a core data object and I saved it all within a playground. And this is a way to experiment with playgrounds, that you can use core data and actually try playing with real core data objects, including some of your own if you move them into a framework. So a few notes about that is that that database, only one thing to know is that really every time you move off of that playground and come back in, all of your database changes are lost. So just kind of keep that in mind, although that's not a kind of nice like automatic cleanup as you would add in any sort of testing system. So that's kind of interesting. All right. So then we have an example with some storyboards. And I'm just going to run Xcode again. Because I mentioned you could load storyboards up out of playgrounds. So what does that look like? So here I have a playground. Or first of all, I'll show you that I have a simple storyboard with just an MK map view. It has some controls down here. And I have this located in its own framework again. So what I'm going to do is go into the playground, and it'll run this. And in just a second, sometimes you'll notice, this is one of the things I was talking about playgrounds being buggy. This is blank over here. It's supposed to be showing something. If it doesn't, you can just always stop a playground, this little stop control, and start it again. And that will usually help it. Another thing to know is that, as I said, playgrounds have to be compiled for the simulator. And you'll also want to make sure that the simulator is a target. And let's try that one more time. Interesting. Well, honestly, not sure why that doesn't work better or at all.
You have to set that in your plist now.
Well, actually, so this is something I was going to mention. That plist warning is actually a different thing. That's because in the weather map framework that I have set up, there's not, well, actually in this app, even like you said, I don't have the plist setting for location. The problem is it's because it's a storyboard instance, it doesn't have really a way to set this plist thing. And so this is one limitation of storyboards that kind of limit you a little bit, is that they do not have, and what he's talking about here is this thing has this warning down here at the bottom. And this is because I had the current location set up for the map, and it's trying to get that, but it's failing. That doesn't actually stop it from working. I'm honestly not sure what has stopped it from working. It's worked every other time I've ever tried it. But in theory, what would happen is this should actually show you the thing showing up in the playground. I'm really not sure why that didn't work. And this is another thing I wanted to show you about this, is that it's real easy now to get views in a playground because you can just set up a live view. The playgrounds now have this concept of a live view, which represents just a view controller. You can pass it any view controller, and it will show up on this side. And so this loaded up properly a view controller out of the framework, and it should be presenting it right now. So not sure why that is, and we'll just kind of move past that. Yeah, all right, so it's a little weird. But that's the approach that I've taken for doing storyboards in frameworks. Just to mention one more thing about it is that I actually have a constructor, weather map VC from storyboard, and that's just there as a way to construct the storyboard from within the view controller. It's a little bit of helper code that just gives me back a view controller out of the storyboard, because otherwise it's a little bit complex. So back to the keynote. So, and then one other example I wanted to show was third-party libraries. So this is where you can explore you can kind of explore third-party libraries really quickly. If you create a workspace, dump third-party libraries into them, and then have some quick way to sort of visually see what they look like with a storyboard, or try playing with their APIs. So, if I go back out of here and try Xcode again, I'm actually going to restart it just in case there's some problem with it there. This is Xcode 8.1, by the way, so it's the very latest one. And so here I have a workspace that I just created with a simple CocoaPods file that loaded up two different UI view shape field things. Let's see here. So, yeah, this is the playground. All right, so what's going on here? Maybe it's the size of this thing. Huh, how interesting. Well, that doesn't work either. Something seems to be really weird with my Xcode because it's not displaying any kind of live view stuff now. So, but anyway, what this did is this is a, oh, there it goes. Okay. Well, not sure what happened. Like I said, they can be a little buggy sometimes. So I have here just a really simple thing where I can enter a text field. And the nice thing is that Playground live views are interactive, so you can actually try doing some things in them, so I can type into a text view that's over there. Now, unfortunately, I made these labels super hard to see with this blue background here. Let's see if I can see if this zooms in much. But I have two buttons here. One is to control, is basically calling a shake from one third-party library, and then this other button is calling shake from a different third-party library. So I'm just kind of playing with parameters of these, and so then I could just look at the code, and I could just examine how I called each one of those and just see which ones I kind of prefer to use. And it's just a really quick way, especially, like I said, just having a workspace created by a CocoaPods thing is really simple. You can just throw in a bunch of third-party libraries and then put in a playground and just try using them all and see what you like. And you can see here that I've imported two things, UI view shake and UI text field shake. And I just use them both in different ways, and I just have some simple helper code that just basically builds up a UI with some stack views and dumps some things in there. And that's how I can kind of explore that really quickly. And stack views in general are kind of nice because you can just make a view controller, put a stack view in it, and then just put things into it, and it just automatically sort of resizes and flows stuff around as it needs to. So they're a good way to do quick UI that you can kind of explore. All right, so let's see here. Just one other thing to be aware of, and this actually happened with the text view library too, is that these two different text view libraries both have just a simple shake method. So I don't even know which would call between those two things, but if you load up multiple third-party libraries, you may encounter some overlaps there. All right, so what kind of things can we do with this stuff? I'm actually going to skip a little bit of this because I really want to show you guys this demo of something that Ari and I worked on last night. We kind of had a mini playground jam last night, and he actually got a whole bunch of AudioKit stuff working in an iPad playground. And I wanted to show you what that looked like, so I'm going to actually have him come up so you can kind of demo that, because you can demo that a lot better than I can. Let me just run up. Alright, let's see here. Let me just run QuickTime.
Well, while he's doing that, I just want to say, so yesterday we saw some talks from Eric and from Craig on playgrounds, and one of the secret benefits you can have when you come to these conferences is that you get access to these people after the talks. So I always go up and bug people, and we collaborated late last night and got playgrounds working for AudioKit, which I didn't even think was going to be possible, because I just assumed you can't get frameworks onto the iPad. But what we basically did is we found out some of the hurdles I had to go through. Is one is that the playgrounds on the iPad can't access the microphone. So my first tests used the microphone, and they all failed, so I was like, forget it, it doesn't work. We got over that hurdle, and then we basically realized we can't do any of the stuff I do at the C level, the C++ level on the playgrounds, but we could do everything that AudioKit does at the Swift level. So I then ported all of AudioKit over to just a raw Swift environment.
Okay,
and we'll see if we get some sound out of this.
Yeah,
so
okay.
The playground book, and then I compiled a bunch of pages of the book and made a book out of it. And so if you go up to the table of contents on the upper left.
Oh yeah, don't click with the mouse when you have a QuickTime Recorder. Important note.
And so there's like 24 new playgrounds. Probably the coolest one to go to is down in Effects. Delay. It's not showing up here as you're scrolling, but I see that you are. Yeah.
It'll be there in a second. Yeah.
Okay. So if you run this code and turn up the volume on your QuickTime.
Let's see here. Oh yeah. Let's see if this works.
And then you might have to play up on the drums.
The Mac itself is low volume too.
Oh, okay.
Coming through the iPad. We get to choose the volume source here.
What?
Is this coming through here?
No.
Well, you can kind of hear it anyway, most of you. And you can change different things about it. You can change your sound source. This one's good.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9.
And so it kind of gives someone a
2.
quick way, without ever having to install Xcode or anything, to get experience with my framework, which I like. And to speak to like the points of the previous talk, it gives kids who have no access to all of these expensive processors, they could actually learn about delay and reverbs and everything just by running something on their playgrounds. So even though technology may not be the greatest, shrinking it down, making it inexpensive can help those kids get practice, which he was all for. So I think this is a really cool use of playgrounds, and I'm thankful for 360 IDEV to help me make this happen in a day of work. So, and there's a bunch of them. It's up on GitHub. I'll post the link right now if you guys want to try it out. That's about it.
Thanks for the assistance there. So, and just one other thing to mention too is that this UI was just something that he had built up programmatically for other storyboards, and he was able just to drop it into the playground book, and it uses that same thing I just showed you, where it basically just sets a view controller over on the other side, and it just showed up. So it was great. It took like almost no extra work to make the UI you already had kind of function there. So that was pretty cool, and so I just wanted to make sure that you guys all saw that and you had time to explain it before he left. So just kill that off and back to the slides here. Okay, so, and this is kind of going, so now that we kind of understand a few basics of what we can do with the frameworks, we just saw one thing there, is that we can kind of show some stuff on the iPad. You can try out simple ideas by moving back and forth, and just exercise frameworks and all these other things we talked about. So a few other practical ways to use this in practice that I've been doing with other projects that I'm on is that you can, of course, just copy code fragments into playgrounds. That's a simple way just to try out a few things you have. Often, like I was talking about, you can just build up temporary views to throw things into to kind of have a more visual approach to understanding what the playground is doing. Now that you can use interactivity especially, that's really nice to have like a little view controller that you can mess with a little bit. And one other thing to mention too is that there's this concept of indefinite execution in a playground. And what that means is that a playground normally will kind of run and then it will just end and then it's done. If you turn on indefinite execution, it's just a line that you can enable. Basically, you have to tell playground support to turn on indefinite execution. That means it'll just keep running. And so if you have something that use asynchronous queues, like especially if you're trying out some networking stuff or other things like that, or audio things, you need to turn that on so that the system can keep processing even after your calls are all done. You can also, just as like kind of quicker things to try stuff out, you can copy whole view controllers. I don't know if you've ever tried this before, but in Interface Builder, you can just take a whole view controller and highlight it and hit copy, and you can easily paste that into a whole other storyboard. And all of the links even will be preserved as far as like what kind of outlets and things you've attached to in the class and everything. So that's kind of handy. If you are building a storyboard or a playground and you just want to quickly reference some data files you have, and maybe you don't have those in a framework, often what I've done is just copy the data file definitions, and then I just stub out all the implementations for actual data methods and just have, like the properties the data method would have, and call it as if it were my real one with some code that I'm trying to play with. And then I can move that code back into my real framework and it will work with the real data objects because it had the actual properties that it would be working with. And then also, of course, you can put stuff in sources. You can just drag a whole file from your normal project into sources. It'll copy it there, and so then you can play around with something with some base of code you already have without having to put it in a framework. So those are some ways to use frameworks or to use playgrounds without necessarily having to go the whole framework distance. And then I just wanted to get a little bit more into the aspect of playing with design, and this is actually something that I thought the audio framework was actually a really nice example of. Is basically, I think playgrounds could be a really good tool for presenting and understanding designs of some subset of your software to other people. And that's a really cool way to use them, I think. It's sort of educational in a way, but almost more of exploration or storytelling, maybe, I like to think of it as, is to understand how something works and help people understand better how things will work. So, like one example is that maybe you could explain how something like some subsystem you were building, you could put a playground in Dropbox and have people load it up on an iPad and be able to play with and understand the code that you were actually doing. And then they could actually make use of it, and everyone would be able to explore it on their kind of own way, even though you were all in a meeting together. So I wanted to show you what that looked like in terms of one thing that I actually did for a client. And this is sort of another aspect of using iPad playgrounds, is that I created also this up again. Oops. Okay, so this is his playground, but we'll exit from that. And so I have this thing here, the state engine design playground. So I run this, and this was just, I needed to create a simple kind of custom state engine for someone. And for people that don't understand what a state engine is, basically it's just a way to basically have, to understand the different sort of phases that some kind of task can exist in and to move between them. And so that's what a state engine could do. And so this is like a little design document that explains what a state engine example is. And the kind of cool thing about playground books in particular that normal playgrounds don't have is that playground books add this extra formatting. You saw this too in the audio kit stuff that he did, but you can have this extra formatting like headers and bolding and kind of sectional information, and you can hide code. So I just have a bit of code here that explains I have these states, and then I show what a state controller looks like. And so this is all code to demonstrate how you would actually make use of this library that I built, the state engine library. And so then if I go and run this thing, you can see it's pretty simple. What it does is it just goes through. I'm going to actually stop and restart that one more time. And it just goes through these three states. So it's pretty simplistic in what it actually demonstrates, but it shows you, you know, that it's kind of going through each of these states, and that when you call next on a state, it moves to the next one and all this other stuff. But the cool thing about this is, and the reason I brought this one up, is because I really just leveraged an existing iPad playground to actually make this work. And so I don't know if you noticed, but back here on this screen, the state engine design has identical icon to the blink screen, and that's because I wanted to kind of illustrate where that came from. And so what I did is I just took that blink playground, I just copied it and duplicated it, and then I just modified it a lot, actually. I added in my own files, I hooked into how it was updating that other side of the view, and I just added my own, you know, custom source to it and changed all the names of it and everything. And you could even change the icon, but that's a really good way. If you want to get into doing iPad playground books, you know, you can find something simple. One of the existing books, especially, they have even simpler playgrounds. If you go up to plus and you create a new playground, they have really simple templates like just shapes or graphing, and that's a really good, you know, starting point that shows you the structure of how playgrounds are, what all the manifest files are like, and all those things. And you can just edit them in place, and you don't have to worry about how to create them. Even though there are some playground book creators, they're a little hard to use, and so I find that it's still a little bit easier just to take an existing iPad playground and then just modify the heck out of it. So that's kind of nice. All right, so just a few other notes. Craig actually talked about some of the other stuff about iPad playgrounds the other day, but I wanted to add a few other extra points that I found over time. Basically, like I was saying, you can just kind of duplicate them and modify stuff. One of the other things is when you add a copy into, if you want to add, you know, you modify it and you want to add it into the Playgrounds app, you can have the iCloud folder that has Playgrounds, you can put stuff in there, but you can put it anywhere in iCloud Drive and you can still load it, because iPad Playgrounds, when you hit plus and you say you want it from Playground Drive, it can explore all of iCloud and you can load it that way. If you have it not in Playgrounds directory, the Playgrounds app will copy it into the Playgrounds directory. Also, when you update it, it will actually show you, it will kind of clear out the icon and show you that it needs to be downloaded, so you can really iterate through it. And let's see here, I just wanted to go through a few other things about that. A few other things of note is that I don't know how many of you have converted to Swift 3 versus staying on Swift 2.3, or are anyone on Swift 2.3, or is everyone? Okay, well, if you're on Swift 2.3, there's a bit of a problem because all of the all the playground stuff just can use Swift 3. It has to be Swift 3. Can't use 2.3. Can't mix it. And even that includes if you have frameworks that are compiled in Swift 2.3, those won't work either. So that's a little bit unfortunate. But that's just something to be aware of. Also, playgrounds over time, Apple will probably change how some of that formatting and other stuff works. So they're a little bit more fragile as over time they will kind of break. But so do tests and other things like that too. And as mentioned, playgrounds don't have permissions for some things you would hope for. iPad playgrounds especially, it can't get to the microphone, photos, anything that requires the plist permission, it can't reach those things. So that kind of limits what you can do a little bit. Other things about going to the iPad specifically is that you'll often get errors in line. If you mess up and there's an error and something crashes, you'll get a pop-up dialog with an error, but sometimes that doesn't happen, and you can open up the console and see logs, you'll see stuff in there. And also, sometimes something in sources may not compile. You may need to just make sure that everything in sources looks clean and the iPad likes it, and that it actually works on the Xcode. And those hidden tags that you see to hide code and format code, sadly they don't work for playgrounds on just normal Xcode. And basically the hint I have for doing these iPad playgrounds is just do it very slowly. Try little changes at a time because it is so hard to debug actually on the iPad. Maybe even try getting it to work on the playgrounds in Xcode first, and then just kind of migrate it into playgrounds for the iPad, and that'll work usually pretty well. And just to summarize, basically the key here is just put everything in workspaces, and then you can put some things in frameworks, and then you can have some playgrounds that make use of it all. So that's it. Thanks. And thank you, John, for an excellent conference. 360 Min is great.
Any questions for Kendall?
Oh yeah, any questions?
Can you say again how you got AudioKit to work inside the iPad?
Okay, well, so basically, since AudioKit is just one of the, his AudioKit just relies on the built-in AV Foundation stuff. He just had to import that, and then he just copied in all the Swift files. Basically, he has some Objective-C that works with AudioKit, and you can't use that with an iPad Playground. So he had to have only a subset of what real AudioKit would offer. But basically, he was just able to take a lot of his source code for AudioKit, put it in his sources directory. And then he was able just to have, he already had playgrounds actually for Xcode, but he was able to mostly move those just into pages for the playground books, and then they just worked pretty much straight up from there. So it was actually a pretty straightforward process. And I think a lot of his effort that he was up really late working on that, like till 4, and a lot of the effort was actually spent in just adding the formatting text and stuff like that too. But like he said, he really liked it because it was now like an even simpler way, because a normal playground, someone would have to have Xcode to try it out and other things, but this way, someone just has to have an iPad, and they can download that playground and start exploring what AudioKit is like without even messing with Xcode or making sure that everything can compile. So it's pretty cool. Any other, yeah?
Is there like a definitive list of the Apple frameworks that are available for use in iPad?
I haven't seen one yet. I'm not actually sure what the limits are, so.
If you go out and look at the format reference for playground books, at the very end of that, they've got an exhaustive list of all the frameworks.
Yeah, and if you download these slides from this link, I have included the Apple Playground Markup Formatting Guide link. I think it's at the end of that, or?
No, it's the other. It's the books format.
Oh, the books format. Okay. Well, anyway, so that may not be as useful. I included a few links at the end of the document too, but not that one. So yeah, I guess look there. Where was that again? Let me repeat that.
It's the playground book reference.
Playground book reference has the list of possible iOS frameworks that you can use on iPad Playground books. So, any other questions? No. All right. Thanks.